Hi guys, let's drift back, slowly, gently, into a world that no longer exists. A world of flickering torchlight, thatched rooftops, heavy woolen cloaks, muddy cobblestone streets, and the constant smell of smoke, sweat, and livestock. This is not the Middle Ages you learned about in school. This is the real one. And here, strange laws didn't just exist. They ruled over every meal, every gesture, every breath. Tonight, I want to show you some of the strangest, quietest, and most forgotten laws of medieval life, but not as a list, as a story, a slow walk through a strange time, where every bite of bread, every pint of ale, every pair of shoes you wore, could be watched by the law. Let's begin in a small town in 14th century England. It's morning. The town crier has already shouted the king's decrees. The streets are muddy from last night's rain, and the baker, his name is Henry, is carrying sacks of flour into his shop. He's thin, with soot on his fingers and deep lines under his eyes. His bread isn't just food, it's political. Because in this town, under the assize of bread and ale, bread is controlled by law. Yes, the exact size, weight, and even price of every loaf is strictly monitored by town officials. If Henry dares to bake loaves that are too small or charges too much for them, he won't just be fined. He could be placed in the stocks, his face smeared with flour, mocked by villagers as chickens wander by. The logic was simple. Bread was survival, and cheating people with tiny loaves was seen as theft of life. So the medieval English created a scale of punishment so absurdly detailed, it borders on comedy. For example, if the price of wheat went up, Henry had to bake larger loaves for the same coin. And when inspectors, called breadweighers, came by, they carried official scales to make sure every loaf matched the royal chart. But it wasn't just bread. Beer had rules too. The law didn't care if it was a festival or a funeral. If you brewed beer that was too weak or too strong, the ale taster would arrive. He was a real official, usually a local man elected yearly, and his job was to walk from tavern to tavern, sampling the drinks and measuring their strength. Not with tools, with his tongue. Sometimes, the ale taster would kneel, pour beer onto a wooden bench, and sit down wearing leather trousers. If, after a few minutes, his trousers stuck to the bench, the beer was declared strong. If not, the brewer could face a penalty. No, I'm not joking. That was the test. And that brings us to the daily meal. In Henry's home, the table was plain, just planks of oak resting on barrels. Breakfast was rare. Maybe some cold pottage from the night before, thick, gluey stew with peas, leeks, or stale bread soaked in broth. Most meals were eaten in silence. There were no forks yet, just knives, spoons, and fingers. But the real curiosity lay in how laws shaped even this. Did you know that in parts of France, it was once illegal to eat meat on Wednesdays, Fridays, and Saturdays, unless you had a special license? Fishmongers made a fortune, selling salted herring and dried eel. And if you broke the rule, a fine. Or worse, confession to your local priest, who might ban you from communion for a month. In the town square, children played with hoops and bones, chasing chickens and poking the mud with sticks. Their laughter echoed off stone walls. But even their clothes were under regulation. In 1363, sumptuary laws in England stated that no one below the rank of knight could wear certain colors, furs, or fabrics. Velvet, only for nobles. Gold embroidery, forbidden to commoners. And if you dared to dress above your station, the town constable might rip the offending garment from your body on the spot. At night, the baker Henry would light a single candle and sit by the fire. His wife Marjorie mended socks, and together they would whisper about the week's events. A man fined for wearing shoes that were too long. A woman forced to pay a fee for serving dinner with imported spices. Even shoes had rules. In the 14th century, men began wearing polaines, long, pointed shoes that curled at the tip like a snail's shell. The longer the point, the richer the wearer. But the church saw this as a sin of pride. So eventually, the king banned shoes with points longer than 2 inches. And tailors had to measure every shoe with a wooden ruler, enforced by local guilds. And this is only the beginning. The Middle Ages were not just castles and knights. They were full of strange, deeply specific laws that shaped every part of life. Many of which, if broken, meant humiliation, public shame, or even worse, being dunked in a cold river by law. But we'll get to that soon. For now, close your eyes and imagine a world where every bread loaf is measured, every shoe is watched, and every pint of ale could get you arrested. As the fire inside Henry's small home dimmed into soft, glowing embers, the town outside quieted, slowly, carefully, as if the very stones of the street were holding their breath beneath the weight of a sleeping world bound in rules. But even sleep in the Middle Ages wasn't free from strange expectations, because in some towns across Europe, the night belonged to the curfew bell, a signal not just to extinguish all lights, but to literally cover the fire in your hearth, as the word curfew comes from the Old French couvre-feu, meaning cover fire. The law demanded silence and darkness after sundown, not simply for safety, but for order, because nighttime was a dangerous thing. Shadowy figures prowled the alleys, some hungry, some angry, and some simply drunk from beer that may or may not have passed the ale taster's sticky trousers test. It was believed that evil stirred more easily at night, and so, across small villages and towns, watchmen would patrol with long wooden staves, whispering prayers or muttering about the devil as they peered into shuttered windows, searching for unlawful flames or suspicious movement behind curtains made of rough-spun linen. Back inside the houses, people slept fully clothed, often in pairs or groups, with woolen blankets infested by lice and filled with the heavy odor of smoke, dried herbs, and sweat, because bathing was rare and water itself, unless boiled or blessed, was considered suspicious. By dawn, Henry would rise again, not by choice but by law, because in some places, bakers were forbidden to start their ovens too late, lest the smell of fresh bread disrupt the market order or tempt beggars to linger. The rhythm of daily life was regulated by bells, by priests, by guilds, and by an endless list of municipal rules pinned to doors or read aloud at gatherings, where half the townspeople couldn't read a single word and had to rely on memory, gossip, or the threat of public punishment to guide their choices. This morning, the village square was already buzzing, not with celebration, but with murmurs of trouble. A woman, Margaret the dyer's wife, had been accused of brewing soup that was too rich for a widow of her standing. She had served a stew, thick and savory, flavored with saffron and caraway, spices that only the merchant class were permitted to use freely. A local official, known only as the steward of the market, arrived with a scroll in one hand and a long wooden rod in the other, used not to strike, but to point, to measure, to accuse. Margaret, shamed and furious, claimed the ingredients had been gifted by a cousin in Bruges, but that made it worse. Imported goods, especially from Flanders, were heavily taxed, and receiving them without declaring the gift could be considered smuggling. Punishment, in her case, would be symbolic rather than brutal, though no less humiliating. She would be made to wear a garland of garlic and onions through the market, with a placard around her neck that read, "I spiced what should be plain." Children would follow her, mimicking her gait and laughing, and the stew itself would be dumped into the mud at her feet. Food in the Middle Ages wasn't just nourishment, it was identity. What you could cook, how you could cook it, and even when you could serve it was dictated by the tangled mess of local and royal ordinances. In some towns, you could be fined for selling meat on Sundays. In others, it was forbidden to sell fish that smelled too strongly, and inspectors would sniff crates with exaggerated faces, declaring their verdicts like judges at a strange, damp trial. And then there was the church, the ever-watching eye that saw not just what you ate, but when and why. On fasting days, which could stretch across nearly half the calendar year, people were required to avoid meat entirely, eating only vegetables, bread, and fish. But of course, there were loopholes. Beavers, for example, were once declared fish by the church because they lived in water, allowing wealthy diners to consume roasted beaver tails on Fridays with a clean conscience and a greasy smile. Meanwhile, clothing laws continued to tighten. This week, a new order arrived from the royal court. Women of non-noble birth were now forbidden to wear veils of silk unless their husbands earned more than £10 a year. Inspectors were sent to weddings, to churchyards, and to festivals, watching closely for shimmering fabrics, foreign dyes, or inappropriate patterns. If caught, the offending veil would be cut, torn, or publicly burned while a priest prayed aloud for humility and modesty. But strangest of all was the law of silence. In certain monasteries and even some towns influenced by monastic customs, silence was not just a spiritual practice, it was enforced by rule. Bakers could not sing as they kneaded dough. Carpenters were instructed not to whistle while they worked. Market criers could only speak during designated hours, and only in tones deemed appropriate. In a world where noise could invite suspicion, even laughter had boundaries. Jesters were regulated, especially during Lent, and could be banned from town if their jokes were considered too merry for the season. A written complaint survives from a mayor in 1371, stating that the laughter of youth near the bell tower was too light and too loud for Holy Week. And so life continued, under candlelight, under curfew, under layers of wool and law. Henry, the baker, kept his loaves perfectly weighted. His wife folded her spices into the darkest corners of the pantry, and children played without singing too loudly. Even joy had to follow the rules. But this was only the beginning, because there were laws yet stranger, laws about pigs in the street, about walking backwards during Lent, and about the precise distance you were allowed to stand from a nobleman when you spoke to him. We'll walk there next. The road outside Henry's bakery was uneven, made of pressed earth and scattered stones, and this morning it carried more than carts and clattering hooves. Shuffling between the town gates and the market square came something not quite human and yet completely tolerated by law. Pigs, snorting, grunting, wild-eyed pigs, wandering freely through town like citizens with 4 legs and no manners. In some places, they were even required. It sounds unbelievable, but in the 13th and 14th centuries, it was not uncommon for towns to have actual regulations about how and when pigs could walk the streets. These weren't neatly penned livestock waiting for slaughter. They were mobile garbage collectors, rooting through refuse, eating rotting food, gnawing on bones, and occasionally biting a passerby if startled. In fact, some cities required citizens to let their pigs roam, believing it was cheaper and more efficient than paying human workers to clean the streets. But when things went wrong, and they often did, there were laws for that too. If a pig injured someone, the pig could be arrested. Yes, arrested. It wasn't just metaphorical. There are historical records of pigs being put on trial, dressed in human clothes, sentenced by magistrates, and hanged from gallows, their crimes read aloud like those of any thief or murderer. In 1386, in Falaise, France, one such pig was publicly executed for killing a child. The pig was given a proper trial, complete with a judge, legal counsel, and witnesses. And when it was over, the town went on with life as if justice had been served. And the law did not stop at animals. Words themselves, spoken, sung, or scribbled, could turn you into a criminal. In the Middle Ages, especially during times of unrest, slander wasn't just a social misstep. It was a punishable offense, even when whispered in a stable or scribbled in chalk on a tavern wall. The wrong poem, the wrong joke, the wrong rumor could land you in a pillory or worse. In 1321, in an English town much like Henry's, a local poet named Geoffrey, known for rhyming satire and bawdy humor, was accused of mocking a local lord in verse. The poem was barely 8 lines long, carved into the side of a wooden ale barrel, but it caught the attention of a bailiff with no sense of humor. Geoffrey was seized, not beaten or jailed, but forced to wear a wooden replica of his own face, a grotesque mask with an open mouth and donkey ears, and made to stand in the market square, reciting church hymns until sunset. These punishments weren't just theatrical, they were symbolic. The law understood that humiliation lasted longer than bruises. A fine could be forgotten, but the memory of standing half-naked before your neighbors, covered in soot or wearing a costume shaped like your sin, clung to the skin for years. And not all laws were written by kings or clergy. Some came from guilds, those powerful collectives of bakers, weavers, blacksmiths, and carpenters who ruled over their trades with iron expectations. To be a member of a guild meant stability, protection, and respect. But to break a guild's rule, that could mean exile. A blacksmith caught sharpening a foreign sword, one made outside the town's walls, might be forced to hammer red-hot nails into a block of raw meat while chanting prayers for honesty. A weaver who dyed cloth with unauthorized colors could be made to wear the fabric as a cape of shame during Sunday service, the colors bright and clashing, a walking warning of what disobedience looked like. And still, the town breathed on. Inside Henry's bakery, the scent of rye and smoke mixed with the sweet hint of dried apples. His apprentice, a boy of 10 with a scar on his hand from the oven's mouth, swept flour from the corners while humming under his breath, a quiet tune, careful not to violate the still-standing order against excessive musical expression before noon. That law had been passed last winter, when a merchant's son serenaded a butcher's daughter during Mass and caused 3 old women to faint from scandal. Even love had rules. Courting the wrong person could cost you. In certain medieval cities, bachelors were forbidden to speak to maidens of noble birth unless accompanied by a parent, a priest, or, in the case of court-protected towns, a tax collector. The theory was that romance often led to scandal, and scandal often led to feuding, and feuding almost always led to lost tax revenue. So the laws stepped in where hearts wandered. And for women, the laws were even stranger. A woman who baked bread too often, who walked the market without a husband, or who spoke too confidently during council debates could be accused of usurping male privilege. The punishment? Not imprisonment, but a ritual called skimmington, in which villagers paraded the woman through town on a cart while banging pots and pans, chanting in rhyme, forcing her to hold a broom like a scepter. It was spectacle, not justice. But to the people of the time, the line between the two was thin, sometimes invisible. And when the day ended, and the sun dipped behind the tower roof and the bell rang softly to signal curfew, none of the strangeness felt strange to them. It was life. It was order. It was law. They didn't question why pigs needed trials, why poets wore donkey masks, or why stew couldn't be too flavorful on a Monday. Because that's how the world worked. And to resist it meant becoming the next story whispered behind flour-dusted doors. But we haven't yet touched the laws of walking, of hats, of names, or of how exactly one was allowed to sneeze during a funeral. That's where we're going next. Morning broke not with sunlight but with fog. A heavy, pale curtain that curled through the streets like a memory the town couldn't quite forget. Somewhere far off, a rooster crowed, not bravely, but as if unsure of the hour, while Henry stirred coals in his oven, watching as embers glowed in slow motion. It would be another ordinary day, shaped by laws so old they no longer seemed like laws, just the rhythm of living. But beneath that rhythm lived rules so peculiar, so painfully specific, that they turned even walking into something you could do wrong. In some towns across medieval England and the Holy Roman Empire, it was illegal for commoners to walk on the right side of the road if a noble was approaching from the opposite direction. The left was reserved for the higher-born, and failure to yield your space wasn't just considered rude, it could be considered defiance. Men had been dragged into court simply for refusing to step into the mud when a baron's horse trotted by. And if a peasant's foot so much as splashed noble boots with gutter water, a fine. Or, in some places, the offender's own boots would be confiscated and nailed to the door of the local tavern, hung like a grimy pair of trophies. But not all movement was horizontal. There were also rules about how many steps you could take in certain places. Within the cloisters of monasteries, for example, specific paths were designated for monks, and some abbeys imposed rules stating that no one, not even visiting clergy, could take more than 7 steps inside the sacred halls without pausing to pray. This rule was enforced by stewards, who would quietly count footsteps from the shadows, holding little counters made of bone or wood. A visitor who walked 8 steps without genuflecting would be gently, firmly, escorted outside, where they'd be handed a short sermon on humility written in Latin. Meanwhile, outside the abbeys and back in town, Henry's wife, Marjorie, stood at a well with 2 other women. The air was thick with gossip, but even there, law hovered close. In parts of medieval France, gathering at a public well was limited to 3 women at a time. Any more, and it was considered an unauthorized assembly. Why? Because talk among women, when unsupervised, was feared. Words could breed dissent, laughter could mask rebellion, and even a recipe whispered too quickly might be mistaken for conspiracy. So local ordinances were passed to limit such moments, and those caught breaking the rule were sometimes fined, but more often given a public warning by the town crier, shamed by name, not for crime, but for chatter. Yet perhaps no law was stranger or sadder than the one that governed grief. In several parts of medieval Europe, there were strict rules about crying at funerals. The louder the wail, the greater the suspicion. Excessive weeping was frowned upon by the church, as it suggested a lack of faith in God's plan. So mourners, even in the depths of heartbreak, were instructed to remain composed. Clergy warned that loud sobs could disturb the dead or signal spiritual weakness, and those who violated the unspoken tone of the ceremony could face reprimand, or even exclusion from future rites. And sneezing? Believe it or not, even sneezing had rules. In 15th century Venice, a sneeze during a funeral service was considered a terrible omen. The belief was that the devil, jealous of holy silence, would try to sneak into the ceremony riding on a breath. So if someone sneezed once, it was tolerated. Twice, that person was asked to leave the church and walk backwards in silence until they reached the street. Sneezing 3 times? That could be interpreted as an act of possession or witchcraft, particularly if the sneezer was a woman, especially if she was unmarried, and absolutely if she had red hair. Of course, these laws weren't always written. Some lived in the mouths of elders, enforced by social fear, superstition, and centuries of repetition. But others, especially in cities with proud scribes and ink-stained records, were carefully documented and stored in dusty chambers, guarded by clerks who knew exactly which line on which parchment allowed them to fine a man for eating too quickly in view of a chapel. And the laws went deeper still. By the afternoon, Henry sent his apprentice to deliver a dozen loaves to the Guildhall, carefully wrapped in cloth, marked with a chalk seal indicating weight and purity. But the boy couldn't simply walk there. In some towns, apprentices were required to follow specific side streets, not the main roads, during deliveries, to avoid being seen by strangers or accused of theft. The streets themselves had designated functions, and the maps of medieval cities, far from the free, open grids of modern life, were like veins and arteries, each path pumping labor and ritual through the heart of the town. And should the boy trip? Should he drop a loaf into the dirt? He would be required to retrieve it, kiss it, then bring it to the guild's refuse basket, not to be eaten but to be counted, because every mistake was documented, every crumb measured. And in the late hours of the day, when the bells began to toll again, slow and uneven, like a heartbeat stretched across rooftops, the streets returned to quiet. The pigs, still roaming, had found a pile of cabbage leaves behind the tanner's shop. A man in long robes muttered curses about the smell. A girl balanced on one foot in the square, playing a silent game with shadows, careful not to step on the cracks between stones, because her grandmother once told her that doing so would bring down the wrath of Saint Eustace. No one questioned these things. They simply were. The rules, written and unwritten, formed an invisible net around every gesture, every breath, every blink. To live outside of them was to be dangerous. To live within them was to be safe, small, and forgettable. And yet the laws would only get stranger from here. Next, we'll follow the rules of names, of colors, of clapping, and of the exact words one could or could not say when speaking to a goat. The light that spilled over the rooftops that morning was thin, almost reluctant, as if the sky itself had grown tired of watching these people live under so many quiet rules. Smoke drifted upward from chimneys shaped like crooked towers, and Henry, the baker, wiped flour from his hands with the corner of his apron, squinting through the morning fog that clung to the narrow alleyways like a second skin. He had heard a strange tale the night before, whispered by a merchant who had arrived from a distant coastal town where, according to rumor, a man had been fined for naming his child after a saint without permission. At first, Henry had laughed, quietly, cautiously, but by morning, the truth of it didn't feel so far-fetched, because in the Middle Ages, even your name could be regulated by law. It wasn't merely custom or religious guidance. In many regions, there were actual edicts that limited which names a parent could give their child. In parts of medieval France and England, only names found in the Christian calendar of saints were considered acceptable for baptism. If a father tried to name his son something pagan, or simply invented a name that didn't carry holy precedent, the priest could refuse to perform the ceremony, and without baptism, the child would not be considered part of the community, the church, or even according to prevailing belief, the path to salvation. And yet, this control over identity extended further than the cradle. Some towns imposed fines for adopting a nobleman's name without the right to do so, while others banned women from taking on male-sounding names or nicknames that implied independence or strength. A widow named Beatrix who dared call herself Baldwin's daughter after her late husband was once summoned by the local bailiff and instructed to call herself simply Beatrix from then on, stripped of lineage and pride in one quiet moment. But names were only the surface of a deeper code, one written in fabric, thread, and color. Sumptuary laws, which dictated what people could wear based on their rank, were among the most invasive legal inventions of the time. A man could be fined simply for wearing sleeves that were too wide, and a woman could be punished for wearing a cloak that trailed too far behind her, because trailing fabric was a sign of wealth and status, and to drag linen or silk through the mud without noble blood was seen as arrogance. In England during the reign of Edward III, the law specifically forbade people of the yeoman class from wearing anything dyed in scarlet, purple, or azure blue. These colors, reserved for the nobility, were not just expensive, they were symbolic. Scarlet for power, purple for closeness to the divine, and blue for legal and moral authority. Tailors who created clothing in these colors, without proof of their customer's status, could be fined, jailed, or, if they were repeat offenders, lose their tools and be banished from the trade. Even buttons weren't safe. Buttons made of silver or adorned with gemstones were strictly regulated. In one town, a young man who wore silver fastenings on his vest was chased through the square by local constables, who tackled him not because he had stolen anything, but because he looked as though he might be wealthy, and that, in itself, was enough to provoke suspicion. Meanwhile, performances and public entertainment, so beloved by common people, were subjected to laws that bordered on the surreal. In some cities, it was illegal to clap during a performance held inside a church or near a shrine. The reasoning, predictably, was rooted in reverence, but the enforcement went further than most could expect. A young couple who applauded during a morality play near a cathedral door were once ordered to spend a day on their knees, facing away from each other, forbidden to speak. The charge? Irreverent joy. And the list went on. It wasn't just where you clapped, but how. In Florence, a certain pattern of rhythmic clapping had been banned by decree because it was associated with a group of political dissidents. To clap that rhythm in the street, even as a joke, could lead to your name being placed on a watch list, your house searched, and your neighbors questioned. But perhaps the most curious of all laws from this era, curious not for its cruelty, but for its sheer peculiarity, was the language law concerning animals. In a quiet stretch of territory along the Alpine foothills, a law was once passed forbidding people from speaking to goats during times of drought. The belief, rooted in local folklore, was that goats, being connected to ancient woodland spirits, could become confused or offended if spoken to in desperation. Farmers were instead instructed to ring bells near their goats or sing wordless tunes, never uttering a name, a command, or even a complaint in their presence. Breaking the rule wouldn't send you to prison, but it would bring the full weight of social pressure. Your barn might be marked with ashes. Children might chant outside your house at dusk. And your name would be entered into the town's drought register, a document updated every year, listing not only rainfall and crop yields, but also those suspected of offending the goats. And still, the town moved on. The fog began to lift. Henry's apprentice returned with a sprained ankle and half a bag of flour spilled on his tunic. A nobleman passed the bakery with a falcon on his arm, glancing at Henry not with hatred, but with that casual condescension that needs no words. And in the square, a boy was being chased for wearing green hose on a Thursday, an odd violation of a market rule that forbade spring colors outside of Easter week. No one remembered when that rule had started, but no one questioned it either. It had become part of the air, like wood smoke or old bread. And as the bell rang again, softly, just once, to mark the noon hour, the town bent again under the weight of rules, customs, and that endless, invisible architecture of law that touched every meal, every breath, and every step. But the laws didn't end here. Soon, we'll step into the courtroom itself and discover how justice was performed not in silence, but in song. And while we've already seen some laws that may leave you puzzled, what's truly fascinating is how deeply intertwined these rules were with the everyday lives of people. Rules that, to us now, might seem absurd, but to them were just the rhythm of their existence. Let us travel deeper into the cobblestone streets and timber-framed villages of the medieval world, where superstition, religion, and power dictated the law in often unpredictable ways. In the German town of Nordlingen, nestled within massive stone walls, townspeople were once subject to a law that forbade the wearing of pointed shoes that extended more than 2 feet beyond the toes. These shoes, called polanes, were not only a fashion statement, but also a symbol of status, extravagance, and sometimes even sin. The longer the point, the higher the social rank it implied. But church officials condemned the fashion as vanity gone mad. One bishop even declared that these shoes were shaped like the devil's horns and that those who wore them were bound for damnation. So, to curb vanity and encourage humility, authorities imposed a strict length limit, measuring each shoe in public markets. Those who violated the shoe law could face hefty fines or be publicly humiliated by having the tips cut off in the town square. But footwear was just the beginning. Let's turn our gaze to 14th century France, where King Charles VI, during one of his frequent bouts of madness, issued a royal decree stating that no one was to touch him without permission, not even his own family or servants. At first glance, this might seem like a royal eccentricity, but the law became so strictly enforced that when his attendants once rushed to save him from falling off a horse, they were executed for violating the order. The court fell into silence and fear, navigating around their unstable king like dancers avoiding a pit. Even brushing his robe accidentally could cost you your life, and so the royal court became a place of quiet footsteps, trembling hands, and absolute caution. Across the Channel, in England, the legal world offered its own flavor of oddity. In medieval London, there was a law that made it illegal for bakers to sell loaves that were underweight. The penalty was brutal. The baker could be dragged through the streets with a loaf nailed to his forehead. To avoid this, bakers began giving an extra loaf for every dozen sold, thus inventing the baker's dozen, a practice that survives to this day. But the fear behind it was very real. One false weight, one chipped scale, and you could find yourself paraded through the muddy lanes, your head bleeding and your business in ruins. So even in something as simple as bread, the medieval world had a heavy hand of punishment. Now let's journey eastward, to the snowy expanses of medieval Russia. There, under the rule of Tsar Ivan III, a peculiar law emerged, the prohibition of beards. Influenced by Western fashions and wanting to modernize Russian society, the state declared that all men must shave their beards, which were seen by the Orthodox Church as sacred. But those who refused were taxed heavily, and not just taxed, but forced to carry a token engraved with the words "beard tax paid." To show their defiance came at a cost. In some cases, soldiers would forcibly shave the beards of resisting nobles in public, causing not just shame, but spiritual anguish, as the beard was seen as a sign of religious devotion and manhood. Yet even in the face of spiritual rebellion, the law stood, razor in hand, asserting the Tsar's vision of a new, clean-shaven Russia. Moving west again to Scotland, in the medieval Highlands, a curious rule once dictated the social responsibilities of bards. Bards, those traveling poets and singers, were legally protected under a law that not only guaranteed them hospitality, but also required landowners to pay them with food and shelter in exchange for songs. It might sound romantic, but the reality was less so. Bards could arrive unannounced, demand supper and firewood, and if refused, had the legal right to compose a satirical poem that would stain the host's reputation for generations. A single verse from a bitter bard could destroy a family's standing, and so many clans grudgingly welcomed these wandering artists, not out of admiration, but out of fear. Their songs were swords, and their tongues more feared than blades. Meanwhile, in parts of Italy during the late Middle Ages, the government imposed a law that banned kissing in public, yes, even between married couples. The reasoning? Public displays of affection were believed to spread the plague. This was during the height of the Black Death, and as cities watched their populations dwindle, fear spread faster than disease. Anyone caught kissing in the streets could be fined or thrown into prison, and in some towns, the penalty included being doused in cold water or made to sit in the stocks. It didn't matter if it was a farewell kiss between lovers or a gentle peck from a parent to child. The fear of contagion made even affection a punishable offense, and it wasn't just actions that were criminalized. In some areas of medieval Europe, particularly under the shadow of the Inquisition, certain dreams were outlawed. That's right, dreams. If someone claimed to have dreamed of flying, speaking to angels, or wandering into otherworldly places, they could be accused of heresy or witchcraft. A young woman in 15th century Spain, for instance, once confessed during Mass that she had dreamed of a bright-winged being who taught her to read the stars. For this, she was arrested and interrogated for weeks, accused of consorting with demons. Dreams, in the medieval mind, were not private. They were messages from God or worse, the devil. And if your dream didn't align with church doctrine, you could find yourself imprisoned or worse. These laws, strange as they seem, were not created in isolation. They were products of fear, tradition, power, and belief. They shaped how people moved, dressed, dreamed, loved, and even laughed. Every law carved a groove into daily life, guiding behavior like a river carving stone. And while many of these rules have long faded into history, the echoes remain. In the way we think about authority, the way we follow rules without question, and the way societies use laws to sculpt the human experience. And we're only just beginning to uncover the bizarre landscape of medieval justice. Let's keep going. The bell tolled slowly as dusk settled over the town, casting long shadows that stretched like ancient fingers across the worn cobblestones and weathered timber frames. Within the walls of the court, a room heavy with the scent of wax, parchment, and old wood, justice was about to be served, but not in any way we might expect. Here, in the Middle Ages, law was as much a performance as it was a decree, and punishment was often designed to be seen, heard, and remembered by every soul within the town's gaze. Take, for instance, the peculiar use of the pillory, that wooden frame which locked the head and hands of the accused, exposing them to jeers, insults, and sometimes far worse. But unlike modern perceptions of mere humiliation, the pillory was a stage on which the community enacted its collective morality. The person locked within might be pelted with rotten vegetables, dung, or worse, while a town crier recited the offense with booming voice, ensuring no one forgot the nature of the crime. This was justice not confined to walls, but unleashed upon the public square. Yet the creativity of medieval punishments did not end there. In several towns across England and France, an offender guilty of theft might be sentenced to the ducking stool, a chair tied to a long wooden beam that was swung over a river or pond. The accused, often a woman charged with scolding or petty theft, would be repeatedly dunked beneath the water, each submersion a watery verdict of shame. The belief was that the water would either cleanse the sinner's guilt or reveal their innocence by allowing the innocent to float, a cruel test with no science but great spectacle. On other occasions, justice was literally carried out in song or rhyme. Jesters and minstrels were employed not just to entertain but to recount the crimes and verdicts in poetic form, spreading tales of transgression far beyond the town's limits. A man convicted of cheating at dice might find his story turned into a bawdy ballad, sung in taverns for months on end, while his name became synonymous with deceit, ensuring his social death long after the physical punishment faded. And the strange did not stop at punishment but extended into the very court procedures. Trials could be decided by ordeals, cruel and often deadly tests believed to be guided by divine judgment. One such ordeal was the hot iron test, where the accused was forced to carry a red-hot iron a certain distance. If their wounds healed cleanly within a few days, they were declared innocent. If not, guilt was assumed. Another was the trial by water, where the suspect was thrown into a river. Sinking was seen as a sign of innocence, floating a mark of guilt, a paradox that could condemn the innocent to death. In the midst of such justice, lawyers as we know them today did not exist. Instead, advocates were sometimes hired to plead a case, but much rested on the word of witnesses, the reputation of the accused, and the whims of judges often influenced by politics or bribes. Law was less a search for truth and more a spectacle of power. Amid this theatrical justice, the town's citizens lived their daily lives cautiously, aware that a wrong word or gesture could send them from hearth to pillory, from market to ducking stool, or from anonymity to a humiliating song that might haunt their family for generations. And yet, life went on. The baker kneading dough in the quiet pre-dawn hours, children playing carefully on the edges of market squares, lovers stealing moments beneath the watchful eyes of neighbors, all under the ever-present shadow of laws strange and stern. But this is only a fraction of the medieval world's oddities in law. Soon, we will explore the curious customs governing marriage, inheritance, and the mysterious rites of witches, delving further into a world where every action was measured, every tradition enforced, and where law and superstition walked hand in hand. The morning sun slipped slowly behind the high walls of the town, its light filtering through narrow windows coated with grease and dust, casting a soft amber glow upon the wooden beams and worn flagstones. Within the confines of homes and halls, the rhythms of life were governed not only by daily chores and religious observance, but also by a labyrinth of laws so intricate and bizarre that they shaped the very essence of human relationships, marriage, family, and even suspicion of the supernatural. Marriage in the Middle Ages was far from the romantic union we often imagine. It was a transaction, a strategic alliance between families, and a matter tightly regulated by law and custom. Among these laws, one of the strangest dictated that no one could marry without the consent of their lord or the local magistrate, lest the union upset delicate balances of power or inheritance. In some regions, couples were forbidden from marrying if they lived within a certain distance of each other's lands, a law designed to prevent the consolidation of too much property under one family, or to stop the mingling of rival clans. Betrothal, too, was solemnized by contracts, often drawn up in formal gatherings where witnesses swore on holy relics that the agreement was binding. Sometimes from the earliest ages, girls as young as 7 could be promised to a future husband. Breaking these promises could result in heavy fines or even imprisonment. Yet, despite these rigid structures, lovers often found ways to meet in secret, sharing whispered words and stolen glances beneath the watchful eyes of housemaids and fathers, the tension between desire and duty woven tightly into the fabric of daily life. Inheritance laws further complicated the picture, particularly where property was concerned. Primogeniture, the right of the eldest son to inherit all family lands and titles, was the norm in much of Europe, leaving younger siblings with little or nothing. This often led to bitter feuds, secret alliances, and sometimes violent confrontations as disinherited children sought fortunes elsewhere, perhaps joining mercenary bands or monasteries. Daughters, meanwhile, were generally excluded from direct inheritance unless no male heirs existed, and even then, their claim was often contested fiercely. But perhaps the most chilling laws of all were those concerning witchcraft, a shadowy realm where superstition, fear, and law collided in deadly ways. Accusations of witchcraft could arise from the smallest quarrel or the sudden death of a neighbor, and once accused, the fate of the suspected, which was sealed by laws that permitted torture, forced confessions, and execution. Yet the definition of witch was vague. Sometimes it was a wise woman skilled in herbal remedies, sometimes a midwife who had helped bring life into the world, and sometimes simply someone who didn't fit the rigid social norms. In some towns, laws forbade women from possessing certain plants or books, declaring them instruments of the devil, while men who associated with such women could be accused of consorting with evil forces. Trials for witchcraft were held in grim chambers where the accused faced a barrage of questions designed to trap them in contradictions, and failure meant burning at the stake, hanging, or drowning. The law here was not about justice but about fear, and the terror spread like wildfire, touching every corner of medieval society. Yet, amidst these fears, communities still gathered for festivals and fairs, places where social order loosened briefly. Here, people danced in the streets, drank fermented cider or ale, and told stories both sacred and profane. The boundaries between law and custom blurred as revelers dressed in masks, joked with authority figures, and, for a few fleeting hours, lived outside the grasp of the ever-watchful law. And so, the world of medieval law was not merely a list of rules but a living, breathing system that controlled hearts and minds as much as hands and feet, weaving itself into every moment from birth to death. It shaped what people wore, ate, loved, feared, and dreamed, carving patterns of behavior that could bind or break a life. But even now, these strange laws are only the surface of a deeper, darker, and more fascinating world still waiting to be uncovered. As dawn unfolded over the bustling market square, the scent of freshly baked bread mingled with the sharp tang of cured meats and the earthiness of herbs displayed on wooden stalls, while townsfolk, garbed in homespun wool and patched linen, moved through the crowd with purposeful steps that had long been choreographed by a web of unseen rules and regulations governing every exchange and interaction within these lively centers of commerce. In medieval towns and cities, markets were not mere gatherings of merchants and buyers, but carefully regulated institutions where the pulse of the economy beat under the watchful eyes of guilds, magistrates, and market inspectors, each empowered by a complex set of laws designed to maintain order, protect consumers, and preserve the delicate balance between trade and social hierarchy. For instance, one of the strangest but rigorously enforced laws dictated the precise measurement and weight of goods sold, such as grain, wool, or spices, often using standardized weights and measures unique to each town, with severe penalties for merchants caught shortchanging customers. These standards were so meticulously maintained that officials would carry out surprise inspections, measuring every sack of flour or bundle of cloth, and any deviation could result in hefty fines, public humiliation, or even imprisonment. Moreover, some towns forbade merchants from selling certain goods on particular days, especially during religious observances, when commerce was seen as a distraction from prayer and piety. Breaking this rule was not just frowned upon but punishable by fines or the confiscation of goods, reinforcing the intertwining of spiritual and economic life. The guilds, powerful associations of craftsmen and traders, wielded their own laws within the market, controlling not only the quality and quantity of goods but also who could practice each trade. Apprenticeships were tightly regulated, requiring years of service and strict adherence to guild rules before a craftsman could earn the right to sell his own wares. Unauthorized trade was seen as a threat to both economic stability and social order, with offenders sometimes publicly whipped or banished. Interestingly, in some cities, the price of bread was fixed by law, often through a royal or municipal decree, reflecting the staple food's vital importance and the desire to prevent unrest among the poor. Bakers who dared raise prices beyond the legal limit risked severe punishment, including imprisonment, as inflated prices could lead to riots and famine. Another curious regulation involved the sale of fish, a vital component of medieval diets, especially during Lent and other fasting periods. Fishmongers were sometimes required to keep their fish fresh by storing them in running water or ice, and were forbidden from mixing species to deceive buyers. Violations were not merely economic offenses but moral ones, as feeding stale or fraudulent fish was seen as an affront to God's provision. Beyond goods and prices, laws also dictated the behavior of those within the market space itself. Loitering without purpose, hawking wares loudly, or even displaying excessive enthusiasm for bargaining could lead to warnings or fines, as the market was expected to be a place of orderly commerce rather than chaotic noise. But the most fascinating and peculiar market law concerned the regulation of odors. Certain medieval towns passed ordinances forbidding merchants from using overly strong scents or perfumes to mask the smell of spoiled goods, as such deception was considered fraudulent and sinful. Vendors caught spraying their wares with herbs or oils to hide rot faced penalties not only from civic authorities but also from local clergy, who condemned such acts as morally corrupt. In this intricate dance of commerce and control, medieval markets were far more than centers of trade. They were stages where law, custom, economy, and morality intertwined, each transaction a performance shaped by centuries of tradition and regulation, making even the simplest purchase an act steeped in social significance and legal consequence. And as the sun rose higher, casting its golden light upon the busy stalls and weaving its warmth into the fabric of the town's daily life, the invisible threads of law continued to pull gently but firmly on every hand, every purse, every voice raised in barter or complaint, reminding all that in the Middle Ages, even the marketplace was a realm of strange laws and enduring order. The glow of twilight painted the sky a deep indigo as villagers and townsfolk alike prepared for the coming festival, a rare break from the strict order of daily life where, for a few fleeting hours or days, the town might breathe a different air, one thick with music, laughter, and the clamor of celebration that both delighted and unnerved the keepers of law. Yet, even in these moments of seeming abandon, laws wrapped themselves around the festivities, defining what was permitted and what could summon punishment as surely as any decree spoken in court. Medieval festivals were elaborate affairs, often tied to religious observances or seasonal cycles, where markets would expand, entertainers roamed free, and the boundaries between social classes blurred just enough to foster joy without threatening the delicate hierarchies of power. But this loosened atmosphere was governed by an invisible hand, with laws so detailed and peculiar that they shaped everything from the music played to the costumes worn. For example, certain towns had strict laws forbidding masked revelers from carrying weapons during festivals, a regulation born of past incidents where disguised troublemakers exploited the chaos to commit theft or violence. Anyone caught brandishing a blade while hidden behind a mask could be seized immediately, stripped of their disguise, and punished publicly. A clear reminder that even masked fun had its limits. Moreover, laws controlled the sale and consumption of alcohol during these events. Taverns and alehouses were often required to cease selling spirits at specific hours, and brewers had to adhere to quality standards lest their wares be declared unfit for festival consumption. In some places, public drunkenness was a criminal offense, with fines or forced service in the town guard as consequences, underscoring a fine line between festivity and disorder. The dances and performances themselves were also subject to regulation. Certain dances, deemed too provocative or associated with lower classes or foreign customs, were banned outright or limited to specific areas within the town. The lawmakers feared that such dances might encourage immoral behavior or spread unwanted influence, and so the joyous twirling and stamping of feet was carefully choreographed not only by musicians but by magistrates as well. Even the songs sung at festivals were not free from scrutiny. Lyrics that mocked nobility, clergy, or the law could be censored or lead to arrests. Jesters and minstrels walked a precarious path, their wit and satire tolerated only so long as it did not cross invisible lines. A jest that offended the wrong person could result in exile or worse, turning what should have been a light-hearted moment into a grim lesson in the dangers of speech. Perhaps most curious were the laws governing gift-giving and charity during festivals. Town councils sometimes required wealthier citizens to distribute food, drink, or money to the poor during certain celebrations, a practice that reinforced social bonds but also served as a means of public display and control. Failure to comply could bring shame and fines, as charity was not merely kindness but a public duty enforced by law. Throughout the festival, the presence of guards and officials was constant, their watchful eyes ensuring that revelers did not overstep bounds, that the peace was kept, and that the law was upheld even amid the clamor. Their presence was a reminder that beneath the masks and music, the medieval world was never far from order, discipline, and consequence. As night deepened and fires flickered against the dark, the town's inhabitants danced and sang beneath the stars, weaving a temporary tapestry of joy embroidered with the threads of strange and enduring laws. It was a delicate balance, a celebration shaped as much by what was forbidden as by what was allowed. And as the last notes of the festival faded into the early morning hush, the laws once again settled around the town like a familiar cloak, ready to guide, restrict, and govern until the next brief moment when order yielded to festivity. Morning light spilled softly through narrow windows onto the wooden tables and stone floors of the taverns and scattered throughout medieval towns, where the day's first customers gathered, their breath still visible in the cool air as they prepared to partake in the meals and drinks that had nourished generations before them. Yet, beneath the warmth of shared food and the clinking of mugs lay an invisible framework of laws and customs that governed not just what could be eaten or drunk, but how, when, and with whom these acts could be performed. In an era when food was both sustenance and symbol, medieval laws extended their reach deeply into the realm of dining, shaping menus, manners, and even the very composition of meals in ways that might strike the modern mind as both meticulous and peculiar. Take, for example, the laws regulating the consumption of meat. In many Christian kingdoms, strict fasts dictated when meat was forbidden, especially on Fridays, during Lent, and on holy days, transforming the act of eating into a form of religious observance. But more than mere abstention, laws were enacted to enforce these fasts. Tavern keepers caught selling meat on prohibited days could be fined, imprisoned, or lose their licenses to sell. Punishment was not only for sellers but also for buyers, and those found feasting on forbidden foods might be publicly scolded or subjected to penance. The law also regulated the quality and preparation of food. Bakers, for instance, were held to strict standards not only regarding the weight of their loaves but also the ingredients used. In some towns, it was illegal to mix different types of flour or to add adulterants like chalk or sand to bread, a practice that, if discovered, could result in fines or the closure of the bakery. The reputation of food sellers was vital, for poor quality or deceit in food was seen as a crime against the community's health and welfare. Drinking customs, too, were tightly controlled. Alehouses and taverns were often licensed by local authorities who set prices, hours of operation, and rules of conduct. Excessive drinking was not only discouraged on moral grounds but also punishable by law, with offenders liable to fines, public humiliation, or even conscription into local militias as punishment for disorderly behavior. Serving alcohol to minors or selling watered-down drinks was similarly forbidden and rigorously policed. Dining etiquette itself was also a matter of legal concern in some places. Laws could dictate who sat where at feasts, reflecting and reinforcing social hierarchies. For example, only nobles might sit at raised tables with fine linens and silverware, while peasants ate from wooden benches with simple pottery. Breaching these seating laws could lead to fines or insults shouted by the assembled crowd. Sharing food across class lines was often discouraged or strictly controlled, for the table was a microcosm of the social order. Moreover, there were odd customs codified in law concerning gestures and speech during meals. In parts of England, it was illegal to blow your nose at the table, considered rude and offensive. Chewing loudly or speaking with a mouth full of food could also be penalized. Such regulations might seem trivial but reflected a deep societal concern with decorum, civility, and the maintenance of order even in moments of private pleasure. Food waste was another subject of legal attention. Laws mandated that leftovers not be discarded carelessly but saved or distributed to the poor. In some towns, throwing food into the street was punishable by fines, as waste was seen as both sinful and a threat to public health. Beggars and the impoverished often relied on such mandated charity, highlighting the intersection of law, morality, and survival. Through these countless regulations, medieval society sought to control not just survival but the rhythms and meanings of communal life around the table. Food and drink became symbols of power, piety, and place, woven tightly into the fabric of law that shaped behavior from the humblest peasant's meal to the grandest banquet. And so, as the tavern fires burned low and the day's last patrons murmured farewells, the laws lingered like shadows over every crumb, every sip, every gesture. A reminder that in the Middle Ages, even the simplest act of eating was bound by the invisible chains of custom and decree. The morning mist hung low over the fields and village pastures as the sun began its slow ascent, casting golden hues upon the dew-dappled grass where cattle grazed and chickens scratched the earth in search of their morning meal. Within these tranquil scenes, the lives of people and animals were deeply intertwined, yet bound by laws so curious and specific that they reveal a medieval world where animals were not simply beasts but beings whose care, control, and conduct were matters of legal concern and social importance. In many medieval villages, the ownership of animals was governed by intricate laws that regulated not only possession but also the responsibilities and rights of owners. For example, dogs valued for hunting and protection were subject to leash laws centuries before such concepts were common. Allowing a dog to roam freely could bring fines, especially if the animal attacked livestock or disturbed the peace. In some towns, it was required that dogs wear collars inscribed with their owner's name or symbol, a measure aimed at identifying those responsible for stray or aggressive animals. But the legal attention animals received extended far beyond the mundane. In England, one of the strangest laws involved swans, creatures considered royal property. It was forbidden for commoners to own or kill swans, and these birds were jealously guarded as symbols of prestige and power by the monarchy. Poaching a swan was considered a serious crime, punishable by heavy fines or even imprisonment, a clear indication of how wildlife could become entwined with social hierarchy and royal privilege. Similarly, in some regions, beekeeping was controlled by law due to the value of honey and beeswax. vital commodities for both consumption and candle making. Laws regulated where hives could be placed to prevent swarms from invading neighbors' properties, and stealing honey was treated as theft of precious goods, leading to punishments that might include restitution and public shaming. But perhaps the most fascinating were laws concerning the behavior and treatment of animals themselves. For instance, medieval ordinances in parts of France forbade cruelty to horses and oxen, recognizing their importance in agriculture and transport. Owners found neglecting or abusing their beasts could be fined or ordered to care for them properly. This legal protection, surprising as it may seem, reflected a pragmatic understanding of the essential role animals played in sustaining livelihoods. Beyond ownership, the ways in which animals could be used were also restricted. In England, laws forbade bear baiting and certain cruel sports in some towns, while in others, these spectacles were encouraged as forms of public entertainment, reflecting differing regional attitudes toward animal welfare and popular culture. In a more mystical vein, there were laws connected to superstition and belief in animal spirits. Some communities believed that animals could carry curses or that certain creatures were familiars of witches, leading to legal codes that demanded the seizure or killing of animals suspected to be involved in witchcraft. Black cats, dogs, and even birds were sometimes caught in this legal web, their fate determined by suspicion as much as evidence. The strange laws extended even to the sounds animals could make. In a few isolated villages, noise ordinances included provisions limiting the times when roosters could crow or dogs could bark, reflecting a desire for order and rest amidst the often noisy medieval environment. Complaints from neighbors about disruptive animals could lead to legal interventions, forcing owners to restrain or remove their beasts. Amid these curious regulations, the daily lives of farmers, herders, and townspeople were shaped by a keen awareness that animals were not mere property but part of a broader social and legal ecosystem, a web of responsibilities and rights that bridged the human and animal worlds in ways both practical and profound. So as the sun climbed higher, illuminating the intertwining paths of man and beast, the medieval laws wove their invisible threads, reminding all that in this world, even the creatures who could not speak were bound by the strange and enduring order of the law. The afternoon sun hung low over the village rooftops, casting long shadows that stretched across narrow lanes paved with worn cobblestones and bordered by timber-framed houses leaning ever so slightly, as if whispering secrets of centuries past. Within this intricate maze of homes, workshops, and public spaces, the laws of the land extended their reach into the very foundations and walls, dictating how buildings could be constructed, maintained, and transferred, reflecting a medieval society deeply invested in controlling both space and social order. Building a house was no simple matter of stacking wood and stone. It was an act subject to a labyrinth of regulations designed to preserve community harmony, ensure safety, and maintain hierarchies. For example, in many towns, there were strict rules about the height of buildings, with ordinances forbidding commoners from erecting structures that exceeded the height of a noble's manor or the church steeple. Such limits were not merely practical but symbolic, reinforcing the social order by ensuring that no one's home could literally overshadow those above them in rank. Further, the materials used were often regulated. In some regions, only the wealthiest could afford or were permitted to use stone or slate for roofing, while others were limited to thatch or wood, more vulnerable to fire and decay. The use of glass windows was another privilege of the elite, as glass was expensive and rare. Common folks' homes were often left with simple wooden shutters or oiled parchment for light. Property boundaries were equally important, with laws detailing how close houses could be built to one another and to public spaces like streets and wells. Encroaching on a neighbor's land was not only a civil matter but could lead to violent disputes, often settled in courts or, at times, through force. To avoid such conflicts, many towns required the placement of boundary markers, such as carved stones or wooden posts, their positions carefully recorded and respected. Interestingly, the right to build on common land was a contentious issue. While common land was shared by villagers for grazing or gathering wood, unauthorized construction on these lands was strictly forbidden and could result in fines or demolition orders. Yet, as populations grew and the demand for space increased, such laws were frequently tested, leading to tensions between individual ambition and communal rights. Fire prevention laws were among the earliest urban regulations, especially after devastating blazes swept through wooden medieval towns. Authorities imposed rules requiring that chimneys be constructed of stone, that hearths be kept clean, and that fires be extinguished by curfew. Neighbors were often held responsible if their fire spread to another's property, and reckless burning could lead to fines or worse. Inheritance and property transfer also fell under legal scrutiny. Laws dictated not only who could inherit land but how ownership was documented and recorded, sometimes requiring elaborate charters, seals, and witness testimonies to validate claims. Disputes over property boundaries or titles were common and could drag on for years, often involving local lords or courts. But beyond the practicalities, property laws also reflected the medieval obsession with status and privilege. Owning a grand home was a mark of social standing, and the right to build or modify a property was carefully guarded to prevent social mobility through architectural display. The shape, size, and even decoration of one's house were governed by law as much as by wealth. Thus, the physical landscape of medieval towns and villages was a map of power, law, and tradition, each stone and beam a testament to the intricate balance between individual desires and collective control. Within these walls, people lived their lives under the watchful gaze of law, their homes both shelters and symbols bound by the invisible chains of strange and enduring statutes. As twilight deepened, and the hearth fires glowed warmly behind shuttered windows, the silent laws continued their vigilant watch over the spaces where life unfolded, reminding all that in the medieval world, even the buildings bore the weight of history's strangest decrees. As dawn painted the skies in shades of rose and gold, the streets of the medieval town began to fill with a procession of figures draped in the fabrics of their station, each garment a carefully crafted symbol of status, wealth, and law. Clothing was never merely about warmth or fashion. It was a language, an expression tightly controlled by a web of sumptuary laws designed to reinforce social hierarchies, regulate consumption, and maintain the delicate fabric of medieval society. Sumptuary laws which governed who could wear what, when, and where were both elaborate and peculiar. They forbade peasants from wearing silks, velvets, or certain colors like purple and gold, reserved exclusively for nobility and royalty, under penalty of fines, confiscation of the illicit garments, or public humiliation. In some regions, a commoner caught in forbidden fabrics might be forced to publicly alter their attire, cutting away silken sleeves or stripping off velvet cloaks in the market square as a spectacle of shame and enforcement. But the rules went far beyond material. Even the styles and accessories were regulated. The width of a sleeve, the length of a train, the size and shape of a hat could all be subject to restrictions. The medieval mind saw clothing as a visible marker of order, and any breach was perceived as a threat to the social hierarchy. For example, in England, there were strict limitations on the length of men's tunics and the height of women's headdresses, laws designed to prevent ostentation and keep social classes distinct. Interestingly, some sumptuary laws also touched on the use of dyes and colors, which were costly and labor-intensive to produce. The deep reds made from madder root, the brilliant blues from woad, or the rare purples from imported dyes were reserved for the elite, while commoners wore browns, grays, and dull greens made from local plants. Illegal use of these dyes could result in confiscation or fines. These laws were not simply about fashion, but were instruments wielded by monarchs and church authorities to maintain control, discourage luxury among the lower classes, and prevent social unrest born of envy or ambition. Clothing thus became a language of power, a visual code that broadcast one's place in the world, and any attempt to break the code was met with swift and public correction. But enforcement was no easy task. As merchants brought new fabrics and fashions from distant lands, and as cities grew with diverse populations, sumptuary laws often clashed with personal desires and emerging trends. Wealthy merchants and skilled artisans sometimes flaunted the laws, wearing finer clothes than their birth might have allowed, challenging the rigid structures and causing consternation among the nobility. Despite the strict regulations, festivals and fairs offered moments of loosened rules, where the poor might don finery for a day, disguising themselves in borrowed garments and reveling in temporary equality. Yet, once the revelry ended, the laws resumed their grasp, ensuring the return to order and distinction. The interplay of clothing and law also touched on gender roles, with regulations defining what men and women could wear and how they should present themselves, reinforcing medieval ideals of masculinity and femininity through fabric and form. Thus, each thread woven, each color dyed, and each stitch sewn was laden not only with craftsmanship but with legal significance, binding individuals into a tapestry of social order that was both seen and felt in every garment worn. As the morning advanced and townsfolk continued their daily rhythms beneath banners fluttering in the breeze, the strange and intricate laws of dress stood as silent sentinels of power, reminding all that in the Middle Ages, even what one wore was a matter of law and consequence. The dawn broke gently over winding dirt roads and forested pathways that snaked through the countryside, where travelers, merchants, pilgrims, and wandering knights set forth into the vast and often unpredictable world beyond the village gates. In this sprawling medieval landscape, movement was far from free. It was regulated by an intricate web of laws and customs designed to protect realms, control populations, and maintain order, reflecting a world where every journey was a negotiation with authority as much as with distance. Travel in the Middle Ages was both necessity and adventure, yet those who dared to cross borders or simply journey from one village to another found themselves entangled in rules that could confound the unprepared. Lords and monarchs issued decrees requiring travelers to carry passes or letters of safe conduct, documents that granted permission to traverse lands that might otherwise be closed or dangerous. Without these papers, a wanderer risked arrest, fines, or worse, as suspicion of spies, thieves, or rebels was common in times marked by feuds and wars. Even within a single kingdom, laws often restricted the movement of certain groups. Serfs, bound to the land, were generally forbidden from leaving their lord's estate without explicit permission, a constraint designed to preserve labor and social order. Fleeing serfs faced harsh penalties if caught, including corporal punishment or imprisonment, reinforcing the rigid hierarchies that underpinned medieval society. In cities, entry and exit were controlled through gates that closed at night, manned by guards who checked passes and kept watch for undesirables. Visitors were often required to register with local authorities, and in some places, lodging houses had to report guests to magistrates, a practice born from concerns over crime and the spread of disease. Travelers were also subject to tolls, fees collected at bridges, roads, or city gates, payments that could be burdensome but were justified by the need to maintain infrastructure or finance local defense. These tolls were strictly enforced, with guards authorized to detain those who tried to evade them. Furthermore, laws regulated the conduct of travelers and the transport of goods. Certain goods, such as weapons, were restricted or required special permits, while merchants had to declare their wares and sometimes pay customs duties. Smuggling was a serious crime, with smugglers facing confiscation of goods, fines, and imprisonment. Curiously, there were also laws governing the speed of travel. In some regions, knights and horsemen were forbidden from galloping through villages to prevent accidents or damage, a rule that speaks to a medieval concern for order even in the chaos of movement. Pilgrimages, a common medieval pursuit, had their own set of rules. Pilgrims often carried badges or tokens to prove their purpose, and some routes required them to register with religious or secular authorities. Certain towns offered special protections or exemptions to pilgrims, but these privileges could be revoked if laws were broken. Despite these constraints, the roads and paths thrummed with life. Merchants bartering wares from distant lands, peasants journeying to markets, knights riding to war, and pilgrims seeking spiritual solace. Each step taken was a negotiation with invisible laws, a delicate balance between freedom and control. And so, as the sun climbed higher and shadows shifted across the landscape, the medieval laws of travel and movement wove their quiet but firm threads through every journey, shaping not only where people went but who they were allowed to become in a world defined by strange and enduring rules. As dawn's gentle light spilled over the workshop windows, the sounds of hammer on anvil, the rhythmic pounding of loom, and the murmur of early morning prayers blended into the symphony of daily toil that defined medieval life. Behind these noises lay an unseen network of laws, customs, and traditions that governed the very act of work, shaping not only how labor was performed but who could perform it, when and under what conditions, revealing a world where labor was tightly bound by regulation and social order. In medieval towns, guilds stood as powerful institutions that controlled trades ranging from blacksmithing and weaving to baking and tailoring. These organizations wielded legal authority granted by royal charters or municipal statutes, giving them the right to regulate entry into their professions, set standards for quality and pricing, and enforce strict codes of conduct. To become a craftsman, one had to pass through a rigorous apprenticeship system, often lasting 7 years, during which time the apprentice was bound to their master and subject to numerous rules governing behavior and learning. Guild laws dictated not only who could practice a trade but how goods were produced and sold. For example, a blacksmith was required to forge weapons and tools to specified standards, using approved methods and materials. Selling shoddy or counterfeit goods was not merely frowned upon but punishable by fines, expulsion from the guild, or public humiliation. The guild's reputation was paramount, and its members enforced these standards with zeal, sometimes harshly. Working hours were also regulated, with laws often tied to religious observances. Craftsmen and laborers were expected to cease work on Sundays and feast days, aligning the rhythms of labor with spiritual life. Some guilds even had rules about the timing of work during the day, with early morning bells signaling the start and evening curfews marking the end, all under the watchful eye of guild officials. Interestingly, guilds sometimes limited competition by restricting the number of practitioners in a given town, a practice that preserved economic stability but could also stifle innovation and opportunity. New entrants had to navigate a web of fees, tests, and sponsorships, ensuring that the guild maintained control over who could earn a living within its domain. Beyond economic regulation, guilds also played social and religious roles. They often provided mutual aid for members, caring for widows and orphans, organizing religious observances, and sponsoring festivals. Laws governed these activities as well, ensuring that the guild's influence extended into the spiritual and communal life of the town. The power of guilds sometimes led to conflict with town authorities or rival groups, especially when their interests clashed over trade rights, taxation, or political influence. Such disputes could erupt into violence or legal battles, reflecting the complex interplay of power in medieval urban life. Outside the guild system, many laborers remained unregulated, often working as day laborers, servants, or peasants bound to the land. Their work was governed more by custom and feudal obligation than formal law, yet even here rules existed, dictating when and how peasants could work, their duties to lords, and the penalties for neglect or rebellion. The medieval world of work was thus a carefully choreographed dance, where every hammer strike and woven thread carried the weight of tradition, law, and social expectation. Labor was not merely a means of survival, but a structured institution shaping identity, community, and status within a world governed by strange and enduring rules. As the sun rose higher and the town's workshops filled with the energy of industry, the invisible laws that regulated work hummed alongside the clang of tools and the murmur of commerce, a silent but powerful force shaping medieval life in every act of labor. In the quiet halls of monasteries and the modest rooms of emerging schools, the soft rustle of parchment and the muted chant of scholars echoed faintly through stone corridors, marking the pursuit of knowledge in an age when education was a privilege guarded by law and custom as jealously as land or title. The medieval world, often painted as shadowed by superstition and ignorance, was in fact deeply invested in the regulation of learning, with laws governing who could read, write, and teach, as well as what knowledge was permissible and how it should be transmitted. Education was primarily the domain of the clergy, who maintained the scriptoria where manuscripts were painstakingly copied by hand, preserving religious texts, classical works, and legal codes. Laws often restricted access to these texts, considering them sacred or dangerous if in the wrong hands. In many places, owning certain books without permission could lead to accusations of heresy or punishment, reflecting a fear that knowledge outside approved doctrine might destabilize society. Schools attached to cathedrals and monasteries were under strict control, with regulations determining who could attend. Generally, education was reserved for boys of noble or wealthy families, although some towns began to establish more inclusive grammar schools. The curriculum was rigidly defined, focusing on Latin, theology, and the trivium, grammar, rhetoric, and logic, subjects deemed essential for clerical or administrative roles. Learning anything outside these bounds was often discouraged or prohibited by law. Teachers themselves were subject to oversight, with licensing requirements and moral expectations enforced by both church and civic authorities. A teacher found spreading heretical ideas or neglecting their duties could be fined, imprisoned, or expelled, underscoring the link between education and ideological control. Literacy rates were low among the general populace, and laws sometimes explicitly forbade commoners from learning to read or write, fearing that widespread literacy might foment dissent or challenge established hierarchies. In some regions, this was reinforced by prohibitions on teaching certain subjects or languages, ensuring that knowledge remained the preserve of the elite. At the same time, universities began to emerge in places like Paris, Bologna, and Oxford, becoming centers of higher learning with their own charters and privileges. These institutions operated under complex legal frameworks, balancing autonomy with obedience to both church and state. Student behavior was regulated by codes that governed dress, conduct, and academic standards, while disputes could be settled by university courts rather than civic ones. Interestingly, the transmission of knowledge was also shaped by laws concerning language and script. Latin was the lingua franca of education and law, and vernacular languages were often marginalized or even suppressed in scholarly contexts, limiting access for those not versed in Latin. Manuscript production and distribution were tightly controlled, with guilds of scribes and illuminators protecting their craft and regulating quality. Copying texts without authorization was forbidden, and theft of manuscripts was a serious crime, as these books represented not only knowledge but significant economic and cultural value. Despite these restrictions, the medieval thirst for knowledge persisted, with scholars traveling great distances to study and debate, sometimes pushing against the boundaries imposed by law and tradition. The tension between control and curiosity shaped a world where education was both a powerful tool and a guarded treasure. Thus, the laws of medieval education were not merely about schooling but about maintaining order, authority, and ideology, woven deeply into the fabric of society and shaping who could access the light of knowledge and who remained in its shadow. As candlelight flickered over manuscripts and the murmur of study filled cloisters and lecture halls, the invisible laws continued to govern the quest for learning, a quiet but potent force guiding minds in a world ruled by strange and enduring decrees. As the church bells tolled softly over the village rooftops and the scent of blooming hawthorn drifted through the spring air, the lives of medieval families unfolded within a framework of laws and customs that shaped the most intimate of human relationships, marriage, inheritance, and kinship. Far from the simple romantic ideals of later eras, medieval marriage was a contract enmeshed in legal strictures and social expectations, where love, duty, and property converged in ways both profound and peculiar. Marriage was more than a personal union. It was a social and economic alliance, carefully regulated by church and state alike. Laws governed who could marry whom, with strict prohibitions against consanguinity, marrying close relatives, often extending several degrees beyond what modern sensibilities might expect. Such rules were enforced with both spiritual sanctions and civil penalties, reflecting the church's desire to maintain moral order and prevent the concentration of property within too narrow a circle. Consent was a complex issue. While the ideal was mutual agreement, arranged marriages were common, especially among the nobility, where unions served to secure alliances, transfer lands, or consolidate power. Laws required public announcements, bans, to be read in church to allow for objections, ensuring that marriages were entered into openly and with communal knowledge. Dowries and bride prices were central to marriage contracts, with laws stipulating the size and conditions of these transfers of wealth. A dowry, often consisting of land, money, or goods, was provided by the bride's family to support the new household, while a bride price might be paid to the bride's family by the groom. Failure to uphold these agreements could lead to legal disputes or annulments. The roles and rights of spouses were defined by law. Husbands had authority over their wives and children, including control over property and decisions within the household, yet wives were entitled to dower rights, a portion of their husband's estate, ensuring some security in widowhood. Laws also addressed issues of fidelity, with adultery punishable by fines, public penance, or even banishment, underscoring the importance of maintaining family honor. Inheritance laws were intricate and varied by region. Primogeniture, the practice where the eldest son inherited the entire estate, was common among the nobility, designed to preserve the integrity of family holdings, while in other areas, estates were divided among children or passed through daughters if no male heirs existed. Disputes over inheritance were frequent and could lead to long-standing feuds, legal battles, or violent confrontations. Laws also regulated the legitimacy of children, affecting their rights to inherit and their social standing. Illegitimate children often faced exclusion from inheritance and social stigma, though some legal mechanisms allowed for legitimization under certain circumstances. Divorce was rare and difficult, requiring ecclesiastical approval and often limited to annulments based on technicalities such as consanguinity, impotence, or prior vows. The Church's control over marriage as a sacrament made dissolution a complicated and socially fraught process. Family law extended beyond marriage to issues such as guardianship of minors, the authority of parents over children, and the responsibilities of kinship networks. Legal obligations to care for elderly relatives or poor kin were recognized, reflecting the communal nature of medieval society. Thus, the medieval family was not merely a private unit, but a legal institution bound by a tapestry of strange and enduring laws that shaped lives from the cradle to the grave. Every vow spoken, every contract signed, and every inheritance passed was imbued with legal weight, reinforcing the social order and the ties that bound individuals to their community and lineage. As twilight deepened and hearth fires flickered within humble cottages and noble halls alike, the laws of marriage and family wove their silent but potent influence, reminding all that in the Middle Ages, even the bonds of love and kinship were matters of law and consequence. Under the heavy shadow of the castle walls and the watchful gaze of stone-faced judges seated in dimly lit halls, the medieval justice system unfolded with an austere ritual that blended tradition, religion, and power into a framework of laws whose strange and often severe punishments shaped every aspect of life. Justice in the Middle Ages was not simply a matter of right and wrong. It was a complex dance of authority, symbolism, and control, governed by laws as peculiar as they were harsh. The administration of justice varied widely across regions, but common threads ran through courts from royal chambers to local manorial halls. Trials could be conducted through ordeal, fire, water, or combat, methods believed to invoke divine judgment, reflecting a worldview where supernatural forces played a direct role in determining guilt or innocence. Laws prescribed these ordeals with meticulous detail, such as the precise way a defendant might carry a red-hot iron or be submerged in water, with the outcome seen as a clear sign of God's will. Alongside these, more conventional courts used witnesses, testimony, and written evidence, though the absence of modern forensic techniques meant that judgments often hinged on reputation, oaths, or confessions extracted under duress. Laws allowed for torture in some cases, justified as a means to reveal truth, though the methods and limits were strictly codified, making medieval justice a system of grim paradoxes. Punishments were as varied as the crimes they addressed, ranging from fines and public shaming to mutilation and death. Laws dictated specific penalties for offenses such as theft, blasphemy, heresy, and treason, each with their own rituals and procedures. Public executions, often gruesome spectacles, served both to punish and to deter, reinforcing the sovereign's power through displays of brutal authority. Interestingly, medieval law also included provisions for mercy and rehabilitation, such as the right to sanctuary within church grounds or the possibility of pardons granted by rulers. These acts were governed by their own legal codes, adding layers of complexity to the administration of justice. The legal process was deeply intertwined with social status, as laws often prescribed different punishments for nobles and commoners for the same crimes. Nobles might face fines or exile, while peasants could suffer corporal punishment or execution, a reflection of the rigid social hierarchies embedded within the legal system. Beyond criminal law, medieval justice encompassed civil matters such as property disputes, contracts, and family law, all governed by a patchwork of local customs, royal decrees, and ecclesiastical mandates. The overlapping jurisdictions sometimes led to confusion and conflict, with cases moving between secular and church courts depending on their nature. Legal professionals, including judges, clerks, and advocates, operated within a framework of laws and traditions that required training, loyalty, and political savvy. Their interpretations and applications of the law shaped the lived experience of justice, often reflecting local power dynamics as much as legal principles. Thus, the medieval justice system was a reflection of a world governed by strange laws where punishment was both a tool of order and a public performance of authority. Every trial, sentence, and execution was part of a larger narrative that bound individuals to the social fabric through fear, faith, and law. As night fell and the echoes of gavel strikes faded into the silence of the courtrooms, the laws of justice and punishment settled once again over the land, a somber reminder that, in the Middle Ages, law was as much about power and spectacle as it was about fairness. As dawn painted the sky with soft hues of pink and orange, market squares across medieval towns burst into life with the bustle of merchants setting up their stalls, farmers bringing fresh produce, and townsfolk eager to barter, buy, and sell. Yet, beneath the apparent chaos of haggling and laughter lay a rigid and often bewildering system of laws that governed the market's rhythm and rules, shaping the very essence of commerce and community in ways both practical and peculiar. Markets were vital centers of economic activity, linking rural producers with urban consumers, and as such, laws surrounding them were complex, addressing not only who could sell what but how goods were priced, weighed, and displayed. Market regulations often required sellers to use standardized weights and measures, a response to widespread concerns about cheating and fraud. Violators who used false scales or short measures could face fines, public shaming, or confiscation of their goods, punishments designed to maintain trust and fairness in trade. In many towns, only licensed merchants or guild members were permitted to sell certain products, a restriction aimed at controlling quality and protecting local economies. Unauthorized sellers, often itinerant peddlers or outsiders, risked expulsion or confiscation of wares, reflecting the tension between established merchants and those on the margins of economic life. Prices themselves were sometimes regulated by law, with maximum prices set for staple goods such as bread, ale, and wool, an attempt to prevent price gouging and ensure accessibility for the population. These price controls were enforced by market officials, known as ale tasters or weighers, who patrolled stalls and inspected goods, a presence that could inspire both relief and resentment. The market was also a place of social control, with laws forbidding disruptive behavior such as loud quarrels, excessive drinking, or gambling within market bounds. Such regulations aimed to preserve order, making the market a place not only of commerce but of community cohesion. Curiously, certain goods were subject to bizarre restrictions. For example, the sale of onions or garlic was sometimes limited during festivals due to their strong odors, which were thought to offend the nobility or disrupt church services. Other laws forbade the sale of spoiled or unclean food, a recognition of the link between commerce and public health. Animals sold in markets were also governed by strict rules. Sellers had to guarantee the health and condition of livestock, with penalties for fraud or mistreatment. Markets sometimes included designated spaces for butchers, fishmongers, and poulterers, each with their own regulations on hygiene and waste disposal, early attempts at urban sanitation. Interestingly, markets were often tied to the calendar and religious festivals, with special fair days attracting merchants from far and wide. These events were occasions for unusual legal exemptions or expanded rights to sell, but also brought increased oversight and the presence of royal or city officials to maintain order. The market thus functioned as a microcosm of medieval society, where economic activity was inseparable from law, custom, and social hierarchy. Every transaction carried the weight of regulation, tradition, and community expectation, shaping not only livelihoods but relationships and reputations. As the sun climbed and voices rose in the lively hum of trade, the laws of the market wove an invisible but firm web over the bustling square, ensuring that beneath the vibrant surface of commerce lay the enduring order of strange and intricate medieval statutes. As twilight descended on the medieval world and the flickering glow of torchlight illuminated the faces of those who had lived under these strange and exacting laws, one could reflect on the complex tapestry woven by centuries of regulations that shaped every corner of life, from the food on the table to the clothes worn, from the markets bustling with commerce to the courts dispensing justice. from the homes built with care to the journeys undertaken across uncertain roads. These laws, often peculiar and sometimes harsh by modern standards, were not mere oddities or relics, but the backbone of a society striving to maintain order, hierarchy, and identity amid the uncertainty of the age. They served to define roles and relationships, to protect the powerful and regulate the many, to balance survival with control, and to encode values that transcended generations. The seemingly bizarre decrees, forbidding the wearing of certain colors, limiting who could own swans, regulating the length of a noble's sleeve or a peasant's tunic, prescribing the exact methods of punishment, or controlling the movement of a serf, were expressions of a worldview where every act was connected to status, faith, and community. In their strangeness, they reveal a time when law was as much about symbolism and belief as it was about practical governance. Medieval laws also reflected the fears and hopes of a society wrestling with change. The spread of new ideas, the growth of towns and commerce, the tensions between church and state, and the evolving nature of power. They were attempts to hold fast to tradition while adapting to new realities, to impose order on a world often turbulent and unpredictable. Many of these laws have long since faded into history, their details forgotten or dismissed as curiosities. Yet their influence persists in subtle ways. Modern legal systems, social customs, and cultural norms still bear the imprint of medieval precedents, reminding us that the past, no matter how distant or strange, shapes the present in ways both visible and invisible. And so, as the last embers of the medieval age glowed and gave way to the dawn of new eras, the strange laws that once governed every aspect of life remain a testament to the enduring human quest for order, identity, and meaning. They tell us a story not only of the past but of the ongoing journey of societies to define themselves through the delicate balance of freedom and control. In the silence of history's long night, these strange laws whisper their secrets, a reminder that even in the most bewildering rules and rituals, there lies a reflection of the human desire to understand, to belong, and to shape the world in our image.